The blood trail stretched behind the wagon for half a mile before Ezra Reed's body finally gave out, and she tumbled onto the dusty prairie grass somewhere between Fort Laramie and the Colorado Territory in the summer of 1876. The wagon train she had been traveling with had already disappeared into the shimmering heat on the horizon, and the men who had shot her during the robbery had left her for dead without a second thought. She pressed her hand against the burning wound in her side, feeling the warm blood seep between her fingers as consciousness slipped away like sand through an hourglass. Gideon Matthews had been tracking elk through the high country when he noticed the vultures circling lower than usual over the eastern plains. He had spent the last 8 years living alone in the mountains, trapping and hunting, avoiding civilization and the memories that came with it. His broad shoulders carried the weight of solitude well, and his muscled arms had grown strong from splitting wood and hauling game through rough terrain. Dark hair fell past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his weathered face. At 30 years old, he had resigned himself to a life without companionship, but something about those circling birds made him urge his horse down from the rocky slopes toward the grasslands below. The sun beat down mercilessly as he rode, and the heat made the air waver like water. He almost missed her entirely. Just another dark shape against the pale grass, but his horse nickered and tossed its head, sensing something wrong. Gideon dismounted and approached cautiously, expecting to find a dead animal, but instead he found a woman lying face down in the dirt. Her dress was torn and bloody, and flies had already begun to gather around the wound in her side. He knelt beside her and pressed 2 fingers against her throat, feeling for the pulse he expected would not be there. But then he felt it, weak and thready but unmistakably present. She was alive. Without hesitation, Gideon scooped her into his arms, marveling at how light she felt, despite being a grown woman. He could see she was young, maybe 22 or 23, with dark blonde hair matted with sweat and blood. Her face was pale beneath the dust and grime, her lips cracked from dehydration. He carried her to his horse and carefully lifted her onto the saddle before mounting behind her, holding her against his chest to keep her from falling as they began the long journey back to his cabin in the mountains. The ride took hours, and several times he thought she might die before they reached shelter. Her breathing grew shallow and her skin felt like fire beneath his touch. He pushed his horse as hard as he dared over the rough terrain, climbing higher into the pine forests where his cabin sat hidden in a small valley fed by a cold mountain stream. By the time they arrived, the sun had begun its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Gideon carried her inside and laid her on his bed, the only real piece of furniture in the sparse cabin. He built up the fire and set water to boil, then carefully cut away her dress to examine the wound. The bullet had entered just below her ribs on the left side, and from the angle it looked like it had missed anything vital. He had treated enough injuries over the years, both on himself and on animals, to know what needed to be done. He cleaned the wound with whiskey, packed it with moss and herbs, and wrapped her torso tightly with strips of clean cloth. She moaned once during the process but did not wake. Her fever raged through the night, and Gideon sat beside her, bathing her face and arms with cool water from the stream, trying to bring down the heat that threatened to consume her. 3 days passed before her eyes finally opened. Gideon was outside splitting wood when he heard a sound from inside the cabin. He dropped the axe and rushed through the door to find her staring up at the rough timber ceiling, confusion written across her face. "You are safe," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You were shot. I found you on the prairie." She turned her head slowly to look at him, and he saw the fear flash through her eyes. He raised his hands and took a step back, giving her space. "I am not going to hurt you," he continued. "You have been unconscious for 3 days. Your fever broke last night." She tried to speak, but her voice came out as a dry rasp. He poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and brought it to her, helping her lift her head to drink. She sipped slowly, and some of the tension left her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. "Where am I?" "In the mountains west of Fort Laramie. My name is Gideon Matthews. What is yours?" "Ezra Reed." She closed her eyes for a moment, and he thought she might slip back into sleep, but then she opened them again. "The wagon train. Are they looking for me?" Gideon shook his head. "I have seen no one. How did you come to be shot?" Tears welled in her eyes, and she turned her face away. "There were 4 men. They rode up fast and started shooting. They wanted the strong box that had the payroll for the mining camp we were heading to. My father tried to fight them. They shot him first. Then they shot the driver. Then they shot me when I tried to help my father. The other wagons just kept going. They were too scared to stop. Your father, dead. I saw him fall. I saw the blood. Her voice broke, and the tears spilled over, running down her temples into her hair. They just left us. They just left us both there. Gideon felt something twist in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced in so long he almost did not recognize it as sympathy. He had isolated himself to avoid feeling anything, but this woman's grief cut through his carefully constructed walls. I am sorry, he said quietly. Rest now. You are safe here. Over the following weeks, Ezra slowly regained her strength. Gideon tended to her wound with practiced care, changing the dressings twice daily and watching for signs of infection. He moved his own bedroll to the floor and gave her the bed, despite her protests. He cooked simple meals of venison, rabbit, and trout from the stream, along with wild vegetables and herbs he gathered from the forest. She ate little at first, but gradually her appetite returned. As she healed, they talked. At first just brief exchanges, but slowly the conversations grew longer. She told him about her life in Ohio, how her mother had died when she was 16, how her father had decided to seek his fortune in the gold fields of California, how they had sold everything and joined a wagon train heading west. She spoke of her dreams of opening a school in one of the mining camps, of teaching children who had never seen the inside of a classroom. Gideon listened more than he spoke, but gradually she coaxed his own story from him. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer. He had married young at 20 to a woman named Sarah. They had been happy for less than a year before she fell ill with pneumonia. He had watched her die slowly over the course of a winter, helpless to do anything but hold her hand and pray to a God who seemed not to hear. After she died, he could not bear to stay in the house they had shared, could not stand the pitying looks from neighbors and family. He had packed his belongings, bought a horse and supplies, and ridden west into the mountains. That had been 8 years ago. You have been alone all that time? Ezra asked one evening as they sat outside the cabin watching the sun set behind the peaks. Mostly. I go into a trading post twice a year to sell furs and buy supplies. Otherwise, yes. Do you not get lonely? He was quiet for a long moment. I got used to it, or I thought I had. She looked at him then, and he felt the weight of her gaze. In the golden light of dusk, with color returning to her cheeks and the spark of life back in her green eyes, she was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. What will you do when you are well enough to leave? He asked, changing the subject. Her smile faded. I do not know. I have no money, no family, nowhere to go. The wagon train is long gone by now. I suppose I could try to reach Fort Laramie and find work there, maybe as a laundress or a cook. That is a hard life for a woman alone. I know. But what choice do I have? Gideon did not answer, but the question troubled him long after they had gone inside for the night. The thought of her leaving, of the cabin returning to its former emptiness, filled him with an unexpected dread. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the sound of her voice, and the sight of her moving about the small space. She had brought life back into the cabin and, if he was honest with himself, back into his heart. By the end of the second month, Ezra was well enough to help with daily chores. She insisted on earning her keep, and Gideon reluctantly agreed to let her take over the cooking and mending. She proved to be skilled at both, preparing meals that were far better than anything he had managed on his own, and repairing his worn clothes with neat, careful stitches. They fell into a comfortable routine. Gideon would rise before dawn to check his trap lines or hunt, returning by mid-morning with whatever game he had caught. Ezra would have coffee ready and a hot meal waiting. They worked together to preserve meat for the winter, to gather berries and roots, to chop and stack firewood. In the evenings they would sit together and talk, or sometimes Ezra would read aloud from the single book Gideon owned, a battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets that had belonged to his mother. It was during one of these evening readings that Gideon realized he was falling in love with her. The revelation struck him like a physical blow as he watched her by the firelight, her hair glowing copper gold, her voice soft and melodic as she read words about love and loss and longing. He had thought himself incapable of such feelings anymore, had believed that part of him died with Sarah, but here it was, unmistakable and undeniable, blooming in his chest like wildflowers in spring. He did not know what to do with this feeling. He had saved her life and given her shelter, but that did not mean she felt anything for him beyond gratitude. And even if she did, what could he offer her? A life of isolation in the mountains, far from civilization and comfort? She deserved better than that. She deserved a town with other people, a proper house, a future with possibilities. But autumn was coming. and with it the first snows that would make travel down from the mountains nearly impossible until spring. Whatever decision needed to be made would have to wait. One afternoon in late September, Gideon was teaching Ezra how to fish in the stream when she suddenly became very quiet. He looked up from baiting her hook to find her staring at him with an expression he could not quite read. "What is it?" he asked. "Why did you save me, Gideon? You could have just ridden past. You could have left me there." He set down the fishing rod and met her eyes. "I could not do that." "But why? You did not know me. You had spent 8 years avoiding people. Why risk bringing a stranger into your home?" He struggled to find the right words. "Because I know what it feels like to be left behind, to be abandoned. I could not do that to another person, even a stranger." "Is that the only reason?" Her question hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. He could lie, could tell her yes, and keep his feelings locked away where they would be safe. But something in her eyes made him brave. "No," he said quietly. "That is not the only reason anymore." She moved closer to him, close enough that he could smell the pine soap she used in her hair, could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "I am glad you found me that day. I know I should want to return to civilization, to find some way to make a life for myself out there. But the truth is, I do not want to leave. I am happier here with you than I have been anywhere else." "Ezra," he breathed her name, and then she was in his arms, and he was kissing her with all the pent-up longing of the past weeks. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his long hair, her body pressing against his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. "I love you," he said, the words feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue. "I did not think I could love anyone again, but I love you." "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I started falling for you the moment I woke up and saw you sitting beside the bed watching over me. You look so fierce and protective, like some kind of guardian angel with a beard." He laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "I am no angel, maybe not. But you are mine." They were married 3 days later in a small ceremony of their own making, standing together beside the stream at sunset with no witnesses except the mountains and the sky. Gideon had no ring to give her, but he took a piece of leather cord and tied it around her finger, promising to replace it with something proper when they could get to a trading post. Ezra said she did not need anything proper, that the cord was perfect because it came from him. That night they made love for the first time in the bed they would now share. Gideon was gentle with her, mindful of the scar that still marked her side, reverent in his exploration of her body. She was equally gentle with him, sensing the vulnerability beneath his muscled exterior, the heart he had kept locked away for so long. Afterwards they lay tangled together beneath the quilts, listening to the wind sing through the pines outside. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, trailing his fingers down her bare arm. "About staying here, about marrying a mountain man who has nothing to offer you but a rough cabin and a hard life?" She turned to face him, her eyes serious. "I am sure, but I have to ask you the same thing. Are you sure about this? About letting someone back into your life? About risking your heart again?" "I am terrified," he admitted, "but I am sure." The first snow came in mid-October, dusting the peaks with white and sending the elk down to lower elevations. Gideon took Ezra with him on a hunting trip, teaching her how to track and move silently through the forest. She proved to be a quick learner, and together they brought down a large buck that would provide meat for weeks. As they worked together to field dress the animal and prepare it for transport back to the cabin, Ezra suddenly stopped and looked around at the mountains surrounding them, at the endless expanse of wilderness stretching in every direction. "What is it?" Gideon asked. "I was just thinking about the day I was shot. If you had asked me then where I would be 2 months later, married to a mountain man and learning to hunt elk in the Colorado Territory, would have been the last thing I would have guessed. Do you regret it? Not for a single moment. It is strange, but getting shot might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. If those men had not attacked the wagon train, if I had not been left for dead, if you had not found me, I would probably be in some miserable mining camp right now, teaching children in a tent and counting the days until I could afford passage back east. Instead, I am here with you, and I have never felt more alive." He pulled her close, heedless of the blood on their hands and clothes. "You have given me my life back. I was just existing before, just going through the motions. You made me feel again." Winter closed in around them, but they barely noticed. The cabin that had once seemed so empty now felt warm and full of life. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking and laughing and making love. Gideon taught Ezra everything he knew about surviving in the mountains, and she taught him things he had forgotten, like how to hope and dream and plan for a future. On particularly cold nights, when the wind howled outside and snow piled high against the walls, Ezra would sometimes wake from nightmares about the day she was shot. She would cry out in her sleep, reliving the moment the bullet tore through her flesh. Seeing her father fall again and again, Gideon would hold her until the shaking stopped, whispering reassurances into her hair, reminding her that she was safe, that he would never let anything hurt her again. "I keep thinking about him," she said one night after a particularly bad dream. "My father, how he died trying to protect that payroll, and how the other wagons just left him there in the dirt. They did not even stop to bury him." "What kind of people do that?" "Scared people," Gideon said. "People who value their own lives more than doing what is right. But that says nothing about your father, and everything about them. He died with honor, protecting what he believed was important. That matters. I wish I could have buried him. I wish I could have said goodbye properly. You can still say goodbye. We can hold our own ceremony in the spring, just the two of us. We can say the words that need to be said and honor his memory the way he deserves." She nodded against his chest, her tears soaking into his nightshirt. "Thank you for understanding, for not telling me I should just forget and move on. Grief does not work that way. Believe me, I know." Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting gradually to reveal the brown grass and budding wildflowers beneath. As the days grew longer and warmer, Gideon and Ezra prepared for the journey down to the trading post. They needed supplies, and Gideon wanted to buy Ezra a proper wedding ring and maybe some fabric so she could make herself a new dress. The trip took 3 days on horseback, following narrow trails down from the high country to the foothills where the trading post sat at the confluence of 2 rivers. The post was run by a grizzled French-Canadian named Pierre Duchamp, who had known Gideon for years. His eyebrows shot up when he saw Gideon ride in with a woman, and his surprise turned to delight when Gideon introduced Ezra as his wife. "Mon ami, I never thought I would see this day," Pierre exclaimed, pumping Gideon's hand enthusiastically. "You must tell me everything. How did you meet? When did you marry?" Over drinks that evening, they told Pierre the story, though they left out some of the more violent details. Pierre was horrified to hear about the attack on the wagon train and impressed by how Ezra had survived. "You are a strong woman," he said, raising his glass to her. "And you, my friend, are a lucky man." "Do not I know it," Gideon replied, looking at Ezra with such open adoration that it made her blush. They spent 2 days at the trading post, selling Gideon's winter furs and buying supplies. Gideon purchased a simple gold band for Ezra from Pierre's limited selection of jewelry, and she bought fabric to make curtains for the cabin windows and a new shirt for Gideon. They also bought seeds for a garden, determined to grow more of their own food rather than relying entirely on hunting and gathering. On the second evening, as they prepared to leave the next morning, a group of rough-looking men rode into the trading post. Gideon felt Ezra tense beside him at the bar, and he followed her gaze to see what had upset her. His hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt. "That is one of them," she whispered, her voice tight with fear and anger. "The one with the scar on his cheek. He was there when they shot me." Gideon looked more carefully at the man in question. He was tall and lean, with a jagged scar running from his left eye to his jaw. He wore a gun low on his hip and carried himself with the swagger of someone who was used to intimidating others. "Are you certain?" Gideon asked quietly. "I am certain. I saw his face right before I was shot. I will never forget it." Gideon felt rage build in his chest, hot and fierce. This man had tried to kill his wife, had left her to die on the open prairie like she was nothing. Every instinct he had screamed at him to walk over there and end the man's life with his bare hands. But he forced himself to think rationally. He was in a trading post, surrounded by witnesses. And more importantly, Ezra had already been through enough violence. She did not need to see more. "Stay here," he told her. "I am going to talk to Pierre." He found the trader in the back room and explained the situation quietly. Pierre's face darkened with anger. "That is Jake Hollister," he said. "Bad man, very bad. He and his gang have been causing trouble all through the territory. The law wants them, but they are hard to catch. They hide in the mountains and come down to rob and kill, then disappear again. Can you get word to the law? Tell them Hollister is here?" "Oui, but it will take time. The nearest marshal is 2 days away." Gideon thought for a moment. "Then we leave tonight, as soon as they are drunk enough to not notice. I am not taking any chances with Ezra's safety." Pierre nodded. "I will create a distraction. You get your wife and supplies loaded up quietly. There is a back trail that will take you north. It is longer but safer." They executed the plan smoothly. While Pierre kept Hollister and his men entertained with whiskey and tall tales, Gideon and Ezra slipped out the back and loaded their horses. They were half a mile down the trail before anyone at the trading post noticed they were gone. They rode hard through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the trading post. Gideon knew that if Hollister somehow learned that Ezra had survived and could identify him, he might come looking for her to eliminate the witness. The thought made his blood run cold. By dawn, they were back in the high country, following trails that only Gideon knew. They finally stopped to rest the horses and themselves beside a small alpine lake, the water so clear and blue it looked like a piece of sky had fallen to earth. "I am sorry," Ezra said, as they sat together on a flat rock, sharing dried meat and water. "I should not have reacted so strongly. I should have kept my face neutral. Now we have to worry about them coming after us." "You have nothing to apologize for," Gideon said firmly. "Seeing the man who shot you and killed your father would shake anyone, and we were always going to leave. This just made us leave a bit sooner. Will they find us? Will they come to the cabin? They would have to know where to look, and this territory is vast. I have been living up here for 8 years, and Pierre is the only person who knows the general area of my cabin. He will not tell anyone, especially not men like that. We are safe." But Gideon made sure to take extra precautions when they returned to the cabin. He set up warning signals along the trails leading to their valley, small traps that would make noise if disturbed. He taught Ezra how to shoot both his rifle and pistol, making her practice until she could hit a target consistently. He showed her hiding places in the forest where she could go if danger ever came while he was away. "I do not want to scare you," he told her one evening as they cleaned the guns together. "But I need to know you can protect yourself if I am not here." "I understand," she said, "and I am not scared. Or maybe I am, but not in the way you think. I am not afraid of them finding us because I know you will protect me. I am afraid of losing you, of something happening to you because of me." He set down the gun he was cleaning and pulled her into his lap. "Nothing is going to happen to me, and nothing is going to happen to you. We are going to live long, boring lives up here in these mountains, growing old and gray together. That is a promise." She kissed him then, pouring all her fear and love and trust into the gesture. He responded with equal intensity, and soon they were making love right there on the floor in front of the fire. Urgent and passionate and alive, summer passed peacefully, with no sign of Hollister or his gang. Ezra's garden flourished, providing them with fresh vegetables to supplement their diet of meat and fish. They spent long days working side by side, repairing the cabin, improving their little homestead, and simply enjoying each other's company. In August, Ezra began to feel ill in the mornings, and by September she was certain of the reason. She was pregnant. Gideon's reaction was a mix of joy and terror. He was thrilled at the idea of becoming a father, but also worried about Ezra giving birth so far from any medical help. The nearest doctor was days away, and winter would make travel impossible. Women have been having babies for thousands of years without doctors. Ezra reminded him when she saw the worry on his face. "And I am strong. I survived being shot and left for dead. I can survive childbirth." "You are right," he said, but the worry did not leave his eyes. They spent the fall preparing, gathering supplies, and making the cabin as comfortable as possible for when the baby came. Gideon read and reread the single medical manual Pierre had given him at the trading post, memorizing everything he could about delivering a baby and caring for a newborn. Ezra seemed to glow with happiness despite the discomfort of pregnancy. She talked constantly about the baby, about whether it would be a boy or girl, about what they would name it, about the life they would build as a family. Her joy was infectious, and Gideon found his own excitement growing as her belly swelled with their child. One night in late October, as the first serious snow of the season began to fall, they lay together in bed with Gideon's hand resting on Ezra's stomach, feeling the baby kick. "I have been thinking about names," Ezra said. If it is a boy, I would like to name him after my father. His name was Samuel. "Samuel Reed. I like that," Gideon said. "Samuel Matthews Reed. And if it is a girl, I was thinking Mary, after your mother." "You said that was her name, right?" Gideon felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Yes, Mary Grace. She would have loved you, you know. She would have been so happy to see me happy again. I wish I could have met her. I wish both our parents could have met each other, could have known about this baby. Me too. But we can honor their memory by building a good life. and raising our child with the values they taught us. That is how we keep them alive. The baby came in March, during a brief warming spell between winter storms. Labor started just after dawn, and Gideon spent the next 12 hours feeling more helpless and terrified than he ever had in his life. Ezra was incredibly brave, never crying out despite the obvious pain, breathing through the contractions the way the medical manual described. Finally, as the sun began to set, Gideon caught his son in trembling hands. The baby was small and red and absolutely perfect. He cried lustily as Gideon cleaned him and wrapped him in soft cloth, then placed him in Ezra's waiting arms. "Hello, Samuel," she whispered, tears streaming down her exhausted face. "Hello, my beautiful boy." Gideon sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Ezra's shoulders, staring in wonder at the tiny human they had created. He had never felt more complete, more purposeful than he did in that moment. "We made a person," he said stupidly, and Ezra laughed. "We did. We made a perfect person." Samuel was a healthy baby, growing quickly on his mother's milk and filling the cabin with his cries and coos. Gideon was a natural father, patient and gentle despite his size and rough appearance. He would walk Samuel around the cabin for hours when the baby was fussy, singing old songs his own father had sung to him. His deep voice rumbling in his chest, Ezra recovered well from the birth, and by May she was back to her normal activities, though now with a baby tied to her back or sleeping in a cradle Gideon had built. They settled into their new routine as parents, tired but happier than either had thought possible. When summer came and they made their annual trip to the trading post, Pierre was delighted to meet Samuel. He gave them supplies as a gift, along with a beautiful wooden rattle he had carved himself. "You are a family now," he said, beaming at them. "This is good. Very good. The mountains are less lonely with love in them." They asked Pierre if there had been any more trouble with Hollister and his gang. The trader's face grew serious. "They were caught," he said, "last fall, not long after you left. The marshal set a trap for them at another trading post. There was a shootout. Hollister and 2 others were killed. The rest are in prison waiting to hang." Ezra felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had not even realized she was carrying. "So it is over. They cannot come after us." "It is over," Pierre confirmed. "You are safe." On the ride back to the cabin, Ezra was quieter than usual. When Gideon asked what she was thinking about, she took a moment before answering. "I was thinking about how much has changed in 2 years. 2 years ago I was on a wagon train with my father, heading toward an uncertain future and a dream that might never come true. Now my father is dead, and I am married to a man I love more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. And we have a son, and we have built a life together that is better than anything I could have imagined. Do you ever wish things had turned out differently? That your father was still alive, that you had made it to California? Of course I wish my father was still alive. I miss him every day. But I cannot wish the rest of it had not happened, because then I would not have you and Samuel, and I would not trade you for anything." Gideon reached over and squeezed her hand. "I feel the same way. I am sorry for how we came together, for the violence and the loss, but I am grateful every day that I found you on that prairie. You brought me back to life." They held the memorial service for Ezra's father later that summer in a quiet meadow near their cabin where wildflowers grew thick and tall. Ezra spoke about her father's kindness, his courage, his dreams for their future. She cried, and Gideon held her, and Samuel gurgled happily from his place on a blanket in the grass, oblivious to the solemnity of the moment. It was closure of a sort, a way to say the goodbye she had never gotten to say. The years that followed were good ones. Samuel grew into a sturdy, curious little boy who loved exploring the mountains with his father. Gideon taught him to fish and track, to identify plants and animals, to respect the wilderness and understand its dangers. Ezra taught him to read from the handful of books they acquired over the years, and to write using charcoal on smooth pieces of wood. When Samuel was 3, Ezra became pregnant again. This time it was twins, 2 girls they named Mary and Sarah, honoring both of Gideon's most important women. The cabin was suddenly very full and very loud, but neither Gideon nor Ezra would have had it any other way. They expanded the cabin, adding a loft for the children to sleep in and a second room for storage and Ezra's growing collection of herbs and medicines. She had become skilled at healing, learning from books and from experimentation, and occasionally people would make the long journey to their valley seeking her help. Gideon's trapping business grew as well, and he was able to sell enough furs each year to buy not just necessities but small luxuries. Books for Ezra, toys for the children, fabric for new clothes, sugar and coffee, and other things that made their isolated life more comfortable. But the best moments were still the quiet ones, after the children were asleep, when Gideon and Ezra could sit together by the fire and talk or simply exist in comfortable silence. They never lost the passion that had brought them together, never stopped finding excuses to touch and kiss and make love even with a house full of children and responsibilities. On their 5th anniversary, Gideon surprised Ezra by taking her back to the spot where he had found her. It was a long journey, several days on horseback with the children staying with Pierre and his wife at the trading post, but Gideon felt it was important. They stood together on the prairie, looking at the grass that had long since covered any sign of violence. The sky was the same brilliant blue it had been that day, and the wind still whispered through the grass, but everything else was different. "I have been thinking about this place," Gideon said, holding Ezra's hand, "about how close I came to not finding you. If I had been an hour later, if I had not noticed the vultures, if I had decided to go a different direction, our entire lives hinged on such small chances. I know. I think about it too. About how I should have died here, how everyone expected me to die here. But I did not, because you saved me." "We saved each other," Gideon corrected. "I was dead in my own way, just going through the motions of living. You gave me a reason to live again." Ezra turned to face him, reaching up to cup his bearded cheek with her hand. "Do you remember what you promised me that first winter? That we would live long, boring lives together, growing old and gray? I remember. It has not been boring. But I still want the long life with you, the growing old and gray together." "You will have it," he promised. "We have all the time in the world." They made love right there on the prairie, in almost the exact spot where Ezra had fallen 5 years before. It felt like closing a circle, like transforming a place of death and despair into one of life and love. When they returned to the trading post to collect their children, Samuel ran to them with exciting news. Pierre had shown him a book with drawings of mountains and valleys, and Samuel had decided he wanted to make maps when he grew up, to document all the secret places his father had shown him so that others could find them too. "Can I do that, Papa?" he asked, his young face so earnest and hopeful. "Can I make maps?" Gideon ruffled his son's hair and smiled. "You can do anything you set your mind to, Sam. That is the beauty of this country. You are not limited by who your father was or what he did. You can forge your own path." As they rode back toward their mountain home, children chattering happily and supplies packed securely, Ezra looked over at Gideon and smiled. He smiled back, and in that moment, everything that had happened, all the pain and loss and struggle, felt worth it. They had found each other in the vast wilderness of the American West, two broken people who had healed together. They had built a life from nothing but determination and love. And they had created a family that would carry their story forward, generation after generation. The mountains rose before them, majestic and eternal, and somewhere high in those peaks was their cabin, their home, waiting for them. It was a small place, rough and isolated, but it held everything that mattered. It held their past and their future, their struggles and their triumphs, their everyday moments and their extraordinary love. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Gideon reached over and took Ezra's hand. She squeezed back, and they rode on together into the gathering twilight, toward home, toward the life they had built against all odds, toward the future that stretched before them bright with possibility. Years continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of mountain seasons. Samuel grew tall and strong like his father, though he inherited his mother's thoughtful nature and love of learning. The twins, Mary and Sarah, were inseparable and wild, climbing trees and catching fish with equal enthusiasm. Gideon and Ezra watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and amazement, marveling at how these three humans had come from their love. When Samuel turned 10, tragedy struck in an unexpected way. Gideon was checking his trap lines in late autumn when his horse spooked at a rattlesnake and threw him. He landed badly, his legs snapping with an audible crack. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but worse was the knowledge that he was 2 hours from home with no way to ride, and winter threatening to arrive any day. He managed to splint his leg with branches and strips torn from his shirt, then began the agonizing crawl back toward the cabin. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles, and by nightfall he had barely made it a quarter of the distance. He built a small fire and tried to stay warm, knowing that if the temperature dropped too far he would be in serious danger. Back at the cabin, Ezra knew something was wrong when Gideon did not return by dark. He was never late, never careless about being away from the family overnight without warning. She tried to stay calm for the children's sake, but her heart raced with fear. At first light, she left Samuel in charge of his sisters with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the fire going. Then she saddled Gideon's horse and set out following the trail he always took to his northern trapline. She found him 3 hours later, barely conscious and shivering despite the fire he had managed to keep burning through the night. "Ezra," he rasped when he saw her. "Thank God." She examined his leg with practiced hands, her face grave. The break was bad, the bone displaced. If it did not heal properly, he might walk with a limp for the rest of his life, or worse. But that was a worry for later. Right now she needed to get him home and warm. Using a combination of strength she did not know she possessed and sheer determination, Ezra managed to get Gideon onto the horse. She walked beside him, supporting his injured leg and guiding the horse carefully over the rough terrain. It took most of the day to get back to the cabin, and by the time they arrived, both were exhausted beyond measure. Samuel proved himself that day, helping his mother get Gideon into bed, fetching water and wood, entertaining his sisters so they would not be underfoot. At 10 years old, he showed the maturity and capability of someone much older, and both Gideon and Ezra felt grateful for the steady, reliable child they had raised. Ezra set Gideon's leg, a process that made him pass out from the pain, which was perhaps a blessing. She splinted it carefully and made him a tincture for pain and infection from her store of medicinal herbs. For the next 6 weeks, Gideon was confined to bed, helpless in a way he had never been before. It was a difficult time for everyone. Gideon struggled with being unable to provide for his family, unable to do the physical work that defined his existence. Ezra took on all of his responsibilities in addition to her own, hunting and checking traps and chopping wood while also caring for Gideon and the children. She was exhausted constantly, but she never complained, never showed the strain except in the dark circles under her eyes. Samuel stepped up in ways that made his parents proud, taking on tasks that would have been too much for most boys his age. He hunted small game with the rifle Gideon had taught him to shoot. He fished through holes in the ice on the frozen stream. He helped his mother with the heavy work and watched his sisters when Ezra needed to be away from the cabin. The twins, sensing the seriousness of the situation, were better behaved than usual. They helped their mother with cooking and cleaning, and they sat with their father for hours, reading to him or just keeping him company so he would not feel so isolated. It was during those long weeks of recovery that Gideon realized how much his family had become the center of his existence. He had spent 8 years alone, thinking he needed no one, and then Ezra had come into his life and changed everything. Now, lying helpless in bed, he understood that his strength did not come from his physical capabilities, but from the love that surrounded him. His family was his real strength, the thing that made him want to heal, to get better, to keep living. By midwinter, Gideon was able to walk with the help of a crutch. By spring, he was walking unassisted, though with a slight limp that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He did not mind the limp. It was a reminder of his mortality, of how quickly things could change, of how precious each day with his family truly was. That summer, when they made their trip to the trading post, Pierre immediately noticed Gideon's injury. "What happened, my friend?" he asked with concern. Gideon told him the story, and Pierre shook his head. "You are lucky your wife found you. Many men would have died out there, I know. I owe her my life, just as she once owed me hers. We are even now." But Ezra, overhearing the conversation, came over and put her arm around Gideon's waist. "We are not keeping score, we are partners. We take care of each other. That is what love is." Pierre smiled. "You are wise, Madam Matthews. Your husband is lucky to have you." "I am the lucky one," Gideon said, pulling Ezra close. As the children grew older, Gideon and Ezra began to think about their education and future. Samuel's passion for mapmaking had not faded, and he spent hours sketching the terrain around their valley, creating detailed drawings of trails and landmarks. The twins showed different interests, Mary gravitating toward healing like her mother, and Sarah toward hunting and trapping like her father. When Samuel turned 15, Gideon and Ezra had a serious discussion about his future. "He is bright," Ezra said. "Too bright to spend his whole life in these mountains. He should go to school, learn properly, become the mapmaker he wants to be." "I know," Gideon agreed, though the thought of his son leaving pained him. "But he is still young. A few more years here will not hurt him. A few more years, yes, but not forever. We cannot keep him here just because we want him close." Gideon knew she was right. Their son deserved the chance to pursue his dreams. Even if those dreams took him away from the mountains, it was both the beauty and the heartbreak of parenthood, raising children to leave you. They talked to Samuel about it, and he was torn. He loved his family and his home in the mountains, but he also longed to see more of the world, to learn from educated people, to make his mark. You do not have to decide right now, Gideon told him. You have time. But when you are ready, your mother and I will support whatever you choose. 2 years later, at 17, Samuel made his decision. He wanted to go to San Francisco to study surveying and cartography. It was arranged that he would travel there with a group of trappers heading west, and he would stay with a family friend of Pierre's who had agreed to take him in. The day Samuel left was one of the hardest of Gideon and Ezra's lives. They stood outside the cabin. The whole family gathered to say goodbye, and tried not to cry. Take care of yourself, Ezra said, hugging her son tightly. Write to us when you can. And remember that you always have a home here, no matter where life takes you. I will, Mama, I promise. Gideon clasped his son's shoulder, man to man. I am proud of you, Sam. You are going to do great things. Thank you, Papa, for everything you taught me, for showing me what it means to be a good man. Then Samuel mounted his horse, waved one last time, and rode away down the mountain trail. Gideon and Ezra stood with their arms around each other, watching until he disappeared from view. The twins pressed against their sides. He will be all right, Ezra said, though she was not sure if she was trying to convince Gideon or herself. I know. We raised him well. He is ready. Life continued in the mountains, though it felt different without Samuel's steady presence. The twins filled some of the void with their energy and constant activity, but the cabin felt too quiet at night, and Gideon and Ezra found themselves worrying constantly about their absent son. Letters came sporadically, carried by traders and trappers who passed through the territory. Samuel wrote about his studies, about the incredible city of San Francisco with its hills and fog and endless ocean views, about the fascinating people he met and the things he was learning. Each letter was read and reread until the paper grew soft and the ink began to fade. Mary and Sarah grew into young women, both strong and capable in different ways. Mary developed her healing skills to the point where people traveled from distant settlements to seek her help. Sarah became one of the best hunters in the territory, fearless and skilled with both rifle and bow. When the twins turned 18, neither showed any inclination to leave the mountains. They loved the life they had, the freedom and wildness of it. Gideon and Ezra were secretly relieved. They had let one child go to follow his dreams. It was good to have the others choose to stay. Gideon was 50 now, his dark hair shot through with silver, his beard more gray than brown. The years of hard mountain living had left their mark, but he was still strong, still capable. Ezra was 40, and age had only made her more beautiful in Gideon's eyes. She moved with the confidence of a woman who knew her own worth, who had survived impossible things and built a life from nothing. On their 20th anniversary, they took another trip back to the Prairie, where it had all begun. It was harder to get away now, with responsibilities and the twins to consider, but Mary and Sarah insisted they go, promising to manage the homestead for a few days. Standing once again on that spot, Gideon and Ezra reflected on the 20 years they had shared. Do you remember what I looked like when you found me? Ezra asked. Bloody and dying, more dead than alive. I remember. I also remember thinking even then that you must have been beautiful when you smiled. I was half dead and you were thinking about my smile. I am a simple man with simple thoughts. She laughed and kissed him. You are not simple at all. You are the most complicated, wonderful, infuriating man I have ever known, and I love you more now than I did the day we married, even with my gray hair and bad leg, especially with your gray hair and bad leg. They are evidence of a life well lived, of challenges overcome. They make you more beautiful to me, not less. They stayed on the prairie through sunset, watching the sky turn colors, holding each other the way they had held each other through 20 years of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. What do you think our lives would have been like if that day had never happened? Ezra wondered. If I had not been shot, if you had not found me. I try not to think about it, Gideon admitted, because that version of our lives is too sad. You would have probably died in some mining camp, worn down by hard work and loneliness, and I would have died alone in my cabin, an old hermit that no one remembered or mourned. Instead, we have this. We have our children. We have our life. That is the only version that matters. 3 years later, a letter came from Samuel with incredible news. He had completed his studies and had been hired by the government to help survey and map the Western Territories. His maps would be used by settlers and soldiers, by travelers and traders, by anyone who needed to navigate the vast wilderness. But even better than the professional success was the personal news. Samuel had met a young woman named Catherine, and they were engaged to be married. He wanted his family to come to San Francisco for the wedding. It was an impossible request in many ways. The journey would take weeks, the expense would be considerable, and leaving the homestead for that long was risky. But it was their son's wedding, and both Gideon and Ezra knew they had to find a way. They made arrangements with Pierre to watch over their property, packed their best clothes, and set out with the twins on the long journey to California. It was the farthest Gideon had traveled since he first came west 30 years before, and the first time Ezra had seen a real city since leaving Ohio nearly 25 years earlier. San Francisco amazed and overwhelmed them. The crowds, the noise, the buildings, the sheer mass of humanity pressed together in one place was almost too much after so many years in the isolated mountains. But Samuel's joy at seeing them again made it all worthwhile. Catherine was lovely, a schoolteacher with a warm smile and intelligent eyes. She reminded Gideon a bit of Ezra when she was younger, and he approved immediately. The wedding was a small affair in a church overlooking the bay, and Gideon walked his son down the aisle with pride bursting from his chest. During the reception, Samuel pulled his parents aside. "I want to thank you," he said, "for letting me go, for supporting my dreams, for teaching me everything I needed to know to make it out here. I know it was not easy to let me leave. It was the hardest thing we ever did," Ezra admitted. "But it was the right thing. You needed to fly, and we could not clip your wings just to keep you close. I want you to know that I am still going to come home to visit. The mountains are still home, no matter where my work takes me. And when Catherine and I have children, I want them to know their grandparents, to learn from you the way I did." Gideon embraced his son, this man who had once been a tiny baby in his arms. "We will be there always." The family stayed in San Francisco for 2 weeks before beginning the long journey home. It had been wonderful to see Samuel so happy, to meet Catherine, to experience the city together, but all of them, even the twins who had been dazzled by the excitement of urban life, were relieved to return to their quiet valley. The years that followed brought the expected changes. Samuel and Catherine had 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, and true to his word, Samuel brought them to visit the mountains every summer. Gideon and Ezra loved having their grandchildren around, teaching them to fish and identify plants and track animals, passing on the knowledge they had spent a lifetime accumulating. Mary eventually married a trapper named James who had come seeking her healing skills and stayed for her company. They built a cabin a few miles from Gideon and Ezra's place and had 4 children of their own. Sarah remained unmarried, declaring she preferred her independence, and became something of a legend in the territory for her hunting prowess and her refusal to conform to expectations of what a woman should be. Gideon and Ezra grew old together in their mountain cabin, their hair going white, their faces creasing with lines earned through decades of laughter and tears. Gideon's limp grew more pronounced with age, and Ezra developed arthritis in her hands that made detailed work difficult. But they were happy, surrounded by family, secure in the life they had built. On their 40th anniversary, they took one final trip to the prairie. They were both 70 now, too old for such journeys really, but they insisted. Samuel came with them, worried about his aging parents, but understanding their need to return to the place where their story began. The prairie looked exactly the same as it had 40 years earlier, as if time had no meaning in that vast expanse of grass and sky. Gideon and Ezra stood together, holding hands the way they had for 4 decades, and reflected on the miracle of their life together. 40 years, Ezra said softly. "When you carried me back to your cabin, did you ever imagine we would have 40 years together? I did not imagine we would have 40 days. You were so close to death. But you fought, and you survived, and you gave me the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." "What gift was that?" "A reason to live, a purpose, a future. You saved my life just as surely as I saved yours." Ezra leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him that had been her anchor through 4 decades of joy and sorrow. "I think we saved each other. I think that is what love does. It saves us from ourselves." Samuel watched his parents from a respectful distance, his heart full of love and admiration. They had given him everything, had shown him what a true partnership looked like, had modeled the kind of love and commitment he now tried to build in his own marriage. He was grateful beyond words for the family he had been born into, for the values they had instilled, for the example they had set. As the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Gideon turned to Ezra and smiled. "Do you remember what I promised you that first winter, when you asked if I was sure about marrying you? You said we would have long, boring lives together, growing old and gray. It has not been boring," he said. "Not for a single day, but we did get the long life and the growing old together. I kept my promise, you did, and I kept mine too. I stayed with you, loved you, built a life with you. We kept all our promises to each other." They kissed then, a gentle press of lips that held 40 years of passion and partnership, of struggles overcome and joys shared. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears on their cheeks. "I love you," Gideon said. "I have loved you from the moment I felt your pulse beneath my fingers and realized you were still alive. I will love you until the day I die, and if there is anything after that, I will love you there too." "I love you too," Ezra whispered. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Getting shot was the worst day of my life, but finding you made everything worth it." They rode back to the cabin as the stars came out overhead, the same stars that had watched over them for 40 years. Samuel rode behind them, giving his parents space to be alone together, to savor these precious moments. The years that remained were gentle ones. Gideon and Ezra spent their days sitting in the sun outside their cabin, watching their grandchildren play, telling stories about the old days, simply being together. They had slowed down considerably, no longer able to do the physical work that had defined their lives. But they did not mind. They had earned their rest. On a warm summer evening in their 43rd year together, Gideon and Ezra sat outside watching the sunset. They did this every evening now, weather permitting, a ritual that brought them peace and contentment. "It has been a good life," Gideon said, his voice showing his age but still strong. "Better than I ever deserved." "You deserved every bit of it," Ezra replied. "You are a good man, Gideon Matthews, the best man I ever knew." He took her hand and kissed her knuckles gently. "I was lost before you. I was just existing, not really living. You taught me how to live again. We taught each other. That is what makes it special." As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to appear, they sat together in comfortable silence, hands clasped, hearts intertwined. They had come so far from that day on the prairie when death seemed certain and the future looked bleak. They had built something beautiful from tragedy, had created life and love from violence and despair. The cabin behind them held the evidence of their life together. The bed where they had made love countless times and where all 3 of their children had been born. The table where they had shared thousands of meals. The shelves holding books and treasures collected over decades. The walls that had sheltered them through countless storms. But more than the physical space, the cabin held memories. Every corner had a story. Every mark on the wood recalled some moment of laughter or tears. It was not just a building, it was a testament to their love, to their resilience, to their choice to build something lasting in an uncertain world. Gideon and Ezra lived several more peaceful years, surrounded by family, dying within months of each other in their sleep, passing gently from this life to whatever lay beyond. They were buried side by side in the meadow where they had held the memorial service for Ezra's father so many years before. Their graves marked with simple wooden crosses and surrounded by wildflowers, their story became legend in the territory. People spoke of the mountain man who found a dying woman on the prairie and saved her life, and of the love that bloomed between them in the wilderness. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried their story forward, ensuring that Gideon and Ezra would never be forgotten. The cabin stood for many years after they were gone, maintained by their descendants as a reminder of where it all began. Visitors would come to see the place where Gideon and Ezra had lived, to stand in the space where such a powerful love had flourished. Some said you could still feel their presence there, in the creak of the floorboards and the way the light fell through the windows, a ghostly reminder of the life they had shared. But the truest legacy of Gideon and Ezra was not the cabin or the stories, but the family they had created. Their descendants spread across the West, each carrying something of Gideon's strength and Ezra's resilience, each benefiting from the example their ancestors had set. They were teachers and trappers, healers and hunters, mapmakers and mothers, all connected by the love story that had started on a blood-stained prairie in the summer of 1876. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the mountains and the stars blazed overhead, those descendants would tell the story again. They would speak of the woman who was left for dead, of the mountain man who found her pulse, of the long journey back to the cabin, of the love that grew between two broken people who healed each other. They would tell it so their children would know where they came from, so the next generation would understand that love could grow even in the harshest conditions, that life could emerge from death, that hope could survive anything. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations. It was a story about survival and love, about second chances and new beginnings, about building something beautiful from the wreckage of tragedy. It was the story of Gideon and Ezra, the mountain man and the woman he saved, who saved him right back, and it would never be forgotten.